What's going on, AP Government people? We have Chapter 6 for you, the 15th edition of Government in America. This one is titled Public Opinion and Political Action. So let's get started. All right, let's talk about the census. This is required by law. It's actually in the Constitution. It says one needs to be taken every 10 years. Every year that ends in a zero, there is a census. And this helps determine how much money each state gets from the federal government, in addition to how many members in the House of Representatives each state gets. So it's very important every 10 years to have your census filled out properly. Let's talk about immigrants now. There are 1 million immigrants that can come to the U.S. by law every single year. And California has the highest percentage of immigrants. That's due to their proximity to Mexico and Latin America, and also to Asia, where a lot of immigrants are coming from, both Asia and Latin America. And California really is the closest to both of those. It's important to note immigration throughout U.S. history. There are three different waves. The first one, it's known as Old Immigration, was made up of individuals from Northern and Western Europe, specifically Irish, Germans, and the British. And the Irish were coming over because of the potato famine, which is what this picture is about here. And Germans were coming over because there's a revolution, and the British were coming over just because they wanted more land and there was an abundance of population in Britain. New immigration, this is really post-Civil War up until about the 1920s, and these immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. And you see Italians, Russians, Jews, etc. And here is actually Little Italy in New York City. So a lot of these immigrants tended to live in cities. And the third wave is from the 1960s to present day, and as I mentioned earlier, it's really made up of Hispanics and Asians. So let's talk about this term you've probably heard before, the melting pot. And this is the idea that many different cultures blend into one. And the U.S. will be soon enough a minority-majority country, which means that America will no longer have a white, non-Hispanic majority, that there will be so many different ethnicities here that white people will no longer be the majority. And African Americans are no longer the largest minority. For a very long time they were. That now belongs to Hispanics. And let's talk about illegal immigration. There are roughly 10.8 million illegal immigrants in the country as of 2009. And the Simpson-Mazzoli Act was passed to try to help rectify some of these issues by requiring employers to keep track of the citizenship of employees. So anytime an employer hires somebody, they need to verify what citizenship that person is. So Asian immigrants, they tend to be the most highly skilled immigrants of any immigrants in American history. They, more often than not, they tend to come here with higher education as well. And Native Americans, there are roughly 4.5 million Americans that identify themselves as Native Americans. They face several obstacles, sadly, in present day. There are many health issues that they face. Education, they tend to be the least educated, and they also tend to be some of the poorest minority groups as well. So there's lots of obstacles that are facing Native Americans. Let's talk about this regional shift, and this is something that's happened since the end of World War II. There's this idea called reapportionment, and I talked about it earlier with the census. This is every 10 years that the number of the House of Representatives, there's 435 seats. Those numbers shift every 10 years. So how many representatives each state gets depends on the number of people living there. So I live in New York, for example, and since World War II, we've seen the number of representatives decline drastically because more and more people are moving to the south and west, and this is called the Sun Belt. So really from like Virginia all the way down to Florida, all the way out to west to California, those states, if you're living in one of those states, are in the Sun Belt because it's a warmer temperature. They have a large increase in population and representation in Congress. The grain of America, this is a very popular term you should be familiar with. Grain, we're talking about gray hair, so we're talking about senior citizens. Baby boomers, those are the people that are born between 1945 and 1964. They are the fastest growing group. There's something like 75, 76 million baby boomers. It is a huge part of the American population. Now, as they get older, they're going to retire and start drawing on Social Security, which is instituted during the Great Depression. This is the second most costly public policy that the government has, only behind defense. And in years going forward, it's going to be more and more expensive as more and more baby boomers are retiring. And senior citizens, they vote more than any other group. And because they vote more than any other group, they also get more attention than any other group from politicians. So politicians are very careful to listen to those groups that often vote. That's why senior citizens have so much clout in politics, because they vote so much. All right, let's talk about political socialization. This is something that definitely appears on tests that you should be familiar with. And what this means is how a person learns or decides their political beliefs. Now, on past exams, I have seen multiple choice questions asked specifically about what is the number one influence of political socialization, or how are people politically socialized? And the answer will be the family. Please make sure of that. So looking at this picture of this guy and his three children here, this miner, chances are they decide their political beliefs, at least early on in life, most likely from him and their family. So this is very influential. And young individuals tend to vote how their parents vote. So if your parents are Democratic, chances are you'll vote Democratic. If your parents are Republican, chances are you'll vote Republican. The mass media also plays a very large role in this, and it's not just news stations. And this is changing in recent years. Things like Twitter and Facebook, that plays a very instrumental role in how people get their news as well. And school is also another way that people become politically socialized. And this is something that Thomas Jefferson really believed in, because he wanted an educated electorate. He realized that, these Americans someday are going to grow up and vote. It's good if they're educated and can make sound decisions on certain policies. And historically, the more educated an individual, the more likely they are to vote in elections. So let's talk about political learning over a lifetime. As individuals age, they tend to become more involved in politics. Again, going back to what I was just talking about a few moments ago with senior citizens and the elderly, they tend to vote more than any other group of people. You'll see all the time on news different polls about virtually any topic. So Gallup polls were really the first polls that were conducted, and they take a sample of the population, and usually it's about 1,000 to 1,500 people. And they can, for the most part, accurately predict how Americans feel. They do something called random sampling, and this is the idea that everyone has the possibility of being part of the sample. You don't need to sample all 300 plus million Americans. You can just do about 1,000 or 1,500 and pretty accurately decide what most Americans feel. The sampling error typically is 2 to 3%. So if you say that 55% of the population supports the president, that really means anywhere from 52 to 58% of the population does, 2 to 3% on each side. Polls must keep with changing times. And one thing that's going to be interesting is for a long time, polls have been done only through home phones. Well, my wife and I, we don't even have a home phone anymore. We just use cell phones. So these are obstacles that polling companies will need to kind of overcome to make sure that they truly are getting a random sample. Let's talk about the role of polls in American democracy. There's this debate, and critics often say, do politicians follow polls too much? And sometimes politicians just need to do what they think is right and not necessarily follow what polls are saying. Polls may create a bandwagon effect. If 80% of the people are supporting the president, most people would say, hey, you know what, I'm going to jump on that as well. Clearly 80% are agreeing. I don't want to be left out. The exit poll is heavily criticized, and I remember in the 2004 presidential election hearing lots of criticism of the exit poll. What happens is news organizations will ask people on the East Coast, say, hey, who did you vote for? And they'll randomly ask people. And they're trying to predict the winners well before all the results come in. And some people argue that that's not fair to people on the West Coast, because that will encourage some not to vote if they think that the winner is in the bag already. And also when it comes to polls, the wording of polls can influence answers as well. The way that questions are asked, you could be talking about the same exact thing, but if two questions are worded differently, you could have two different results. So what do polls reveal about Americans' political information? This is one of my favorite questions that I like to ask my students sometimes, is just two simple questions. One, who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? Two, who lives in a pineapple under the sea? Most Americans would be able to tell you the second answer. I don't know if most could tell you the first one. And if you're wondering, here is who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But I'm sure you all know that SpongeBob lives in a pineapple under the sea. If you've ever watched The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, he used to do a thing called jaywalking, the same idea, how little many Americans actually know about politics. All right, let's talk about the decline of trust in government. This has really happened since the end of World War II, and especially since the 1960s. You have things like the Gulf of Tonkin, Watergate scandal, and here's Nixon getting ready to resign, and also the Iran hostage crisis. There's just countless examples of government screw-ups in which people began to lose faith in the government. And many Americans believe that the government that government solutions to problems are wasteful, that maybe the government has good intentions, but the actual solutions are not very helpful, and in fact they are more wasteful. Very broad, simple terms: liberals favor a larger central government and conservatives favor a smaller central government, or a smaller role of the federal government. So who exactly are liberals and conservatives? More often than not throughout history, America as a whole tends to side with the conservative side. African Americans tend to be more liberal, as do women. And there's something called the gender gap, in which women are more likely to support Democrats than they are Republicans. Now, religion, people often think that religion and politics kind of go hand in hand. What's interesting is that it doesn't really matter what religion somebody is, rather it's the importance of religion in a person's life helps influence their views. So what religion they are is less important, but rather how religious they are. So it doesn't really matter if somebody's a Protestant or a Catholic or a Jew or a Muslim, but really what matters is how influential that religion is in their daily lives. The more religious somebody is, the more conservative they tend to be typically. Do people think in ideological terms? Many voters do not connect ideology to voting. So many voters simply vote on other issues rather than I am a liberal, so I'm going to vote for liberal candidates, or I am a conservative and I will vote for conservative candidates. All right, political participation is more than just voting. Things like protesting, writing government officials, etc. There are many ways that you can become involved in the government without just voting. So we have conventional participation, which is voting and door-to-door campaigning, and then you have unconventional participation, which is protesting and civil disobedience. Now, a majority of Americans vote, but that really tends to be the only form of participation that a majority of Americans participate in. In other words, most Americans stop at voting. They don't do the door-to-door campaigning. They don't protest. They don't do civil disobedience. Now, protest as participation, this is where we see unconventional, and this seeks to change policy. You have civil disobedience, which is an enormously important concept throughout not just American history, but world history. We see this really in the 1840s with Henry David Thoreau when he was protesting the Mexican-American War. Gandhi picks this up in the early 20th century against the British, and then Martin Luther King Jr. Really extends on this as well during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. The higher the economic status of an individual, the more likely one is to participate in politics. And again, that's the same idea with education. The more education somebody has, the more likely they are to vote. And blacks are more likely to vote than whites in elections. And the higher the voter turnout for a group, the more politicians pay attention to that group. Again, going back to senior citizens and the elderly, they vote more than any other group. So that group gets paid a lot of attention by politicians. All right, so let's talk about public attitudes towards the scope of government. Let's look at Reagan's inaugural address from 1980. I have this quote from the Chapter 3 video of this textbook, and he said, "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem." So really, since the 1960s, many people have criticized the size of the government. It really started with Barry Goldwater in 1964 in his election versus Lyndon B. Johnson, and I have a video on that in the description below if you want to check it out. In 1980, 50% of Americans felt that the government was too powerful. And many people today feel it is too big, yet they want more spending on certain programs like education and Social Security. So this is really kind of a paradox. Can you have increased spending in the government, which will lead to the government getting bigger, but still people feeling that the government is too big? All right, let's do a quick recap of this chapter. Definitely know the melting pot theory and the three waves of immigration throughout U.S. history. Political socialization, be able to recognize that families play the #1 role in that. Polls and sampling errors, be familiar with both of those. And liberals versus conservatives. Who tend to be liberals, who tend to be conservatives, whether it's women, African Americans, religious people, be familiar with those. Religion and politics, again, the idea that the more religious you are, the more likely you are to be conservative. And conventional versus unconventional participation. Definitely be able to identify and describe those different types of participation. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. If you have not already, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel. Help me spread the word with this video if you found it helpful. Please share it with somebody. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I thank you guys very much for watching, and have a good day.